All right, welcome everyone to this session on choosing your CMMC team. And that's going to consist of C3PAOs, MSPs, consultants, external service providers. I'm your host, Jamie Leupold. I'm the Director of Channels and Alliances at Prevail, CMMC Certified Professional. Joined today with me is Robert McVeigh from Smithers Quality Assessments, authorized C3PAO, and Tim Schilbach from Panacity, also an authorized C3PAO. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining. We're looking forward to a great session. For the audience members, we will have some polls throughout, so please pay attention to that. And then towards the end, we'll have some rapid fire Q&A where you have the potential to win a prize. When we think about choosing a CMMC team, I really think about, CMMC is really the ultimate team sport. And I liken it to building a football team, which is also the ultimate team sport. And I think it's super timely. To add on to that, I don't know how many of you paid attention to the Cyber AB town hall last night, but this very topic came up. So not to spoil the entirety of the session, but I just thought it was really interesting that this was brought up on the town hall, and we'll dive a little bit more into that as we go throughout. But I think, the first thing that you need to do when building out your CMMC team is take inventory, right? Understand what do you have for internal resources and where you potentially need to go and find some, free agents. And when we're building out a team, we've got to understand who's driving the program for us, who's going to help with technical controls, who's going to help with documentation. These are all critical aspects. And Robert and Tim, I know, when we discuss this, I think the most important thing is understanding. And we do have our first poll question, so we'll please do answer that. But really understanding that CMMC it's not a technical checklist that you're going through. It really is a cultural a cultural event for the organization to achieve compliance. Robert and Tim, anything you'd like to add there? I know this was something that was really important that you brought up.
No, absolutely. So I'll go first, I guess, on this one here. Like you stated, Jamie, CMMC is truly a team sport, and there's a whole ecosystem of people sort of involved within this process, right? Not just you, the organization seeking the certification, but most organizations nowadays have a plethora of other organizations that they've engaged with, whether they're managed security or service providers. We would classify those as ESPs or external service providers. And of course, assessors and the C3PAOs who are going to come in and conduct your assessment. And even Matthew Travis, our president of the Cyber AB, has stated that RPOs or registered provider organizations who will help Sherpa you through the CMMC process should all seek to have relationships with C3PAOs, so just so we can understand how we all work together and what we do overall, right? So technology alignment, and understanding processes which could speed assessments in the long run.
Robert, anything to add there?
Yeah, and Jimmy, I was going to chime in on right now, one of the trends we're seeing is most of our clients that struggle with CMMC aren't having a challenge with the technical implementation. Their technical implementation, especially if they're using Azure Gov, GCC, AWS Gov, etc., when they're using those kinds of platforms, the technical implementation is usually pretty spot on. The challenge is the documentation and the policies and the procedures is where we find clients are tripping on themselves, and it's things that are especially like outside the purview of the technical, things like audits and auditing control and training their people and making sure their people are up to date, with background reviews and training, et cetera. That's where we're finding a lot of the problems, and it comes down to that documentation. We hire, you hire the MSP. The MSP takes care of the technical implementation, but the back end, the people illities of the system is where most of our clients are getting tripped up during the pre-assessment or even the phase ones in this assessment process.
Thanks. And I think, what we're talking about here is trying to reduce the overall assessment burden, reduce the overall, don't make any costly mistakes when you're building out your team. I think it was really timely, what the poll came in, and very interesting results to me that we asked, what are people budgeting for this? it was almost equal across the board. That 25 or so percent, 20% in the 100K, but everybody there's certainly no consensus here, which I find interesting. And that speaks to building in efficiencies as much as possible to help drive down those costs is going to be really important. Robert, I thought we had a really interesting discussion around who should be leading, CMMC from the OSC's perspective. Should you hire somebody that's a consultant, that's an expert in this to come in and help you build a program maybe for 3 to 6 months? Do you have to have somebody that can lead this, directly within the OSCs? And what I thought was interesting is you said one of the big red flags when you're going through, let's say, the phase 1 of the assessment and you're just interviewing, with the OSC. Um, Maybe you expound upon what you shared with me there, what you see as a big red flag when you're asking questions and who's typically answering those questions.
Absolutely. One of the red flags for us is always whether or not the OSC, the leadership of the OSC, understands what they've got. And that big red flag is when we start doing the assessment and we start off and they've got a consultant that's come in, whether it's an RPO, an RPA, et cetera, or even another CCA. And so they run in and we start asking the questions, and you see the leadership of the OSC kind of sit back in their chair and they pivot over, and I'll pick on Tim for a second. They'll say Tim's their consultant. They say, "Hey, Tim, answer that one." Or, "Tim, how's that?" And after about the third time they've referred to Tim, you start to realize the organization itself doesn't understand their own CMMC program. And so that's usually when we will gently start pushing back. And we come from an auditor compliance standpoint. So we start pushing back saying, well, wait a minute, hey, Robert, why don't you describe how this operates for the company? And when they keep pivoting back to their MSP or they keep pivoting back to their RPO or their consultant, that's when we know the company doesn't understand it. And what that does, from my perspective as an assessor in the space and as an ISO inspector, regardless, is that it starts to make me wonder whether or not the company understands what they've got, number one. Number two, what they've done is they've made that consultant or that RPO so critical that they can't leave the organization. That if they do leave the organization is going to struggle with their own program. What you want is a healthy mix. What I really like to see is when the OSC steps up and says, okay, we use multi-factor, we're Azure Gov, using GCC High, and we use Entra, and I tell the MSP how I want it provisioned, et cetera. That kind of description is great because at least what it's telling us, the OSC understands the basics of the mechanics. Now, does the OSC understand how to instantiate Entra and make Entra and Active Directory work together? Probably not, and that's okay. That's what he pays the MSP to do. But the leadership of the organization should at least understand what's going on in their environment, what's the basic mechanics of it, and more importantly, who to pick up the phone and call in the middle of the night when it doesn't work.
Thanks, Robert. So we have the next poll question coming up. So I think, Robert, what I'm hearing, if we go back to the football analogy, is really the head coach has to be within the OSC's environment. And it's okay, to have an offensive coordinator that might know the more detailed minutia of the plays, that's an external service provider, that's calling out the individual plays. But the head coach has to drive the culture and they have to drive the overall program. And that's got to be, part of the OSC.
I'm going to steal that analogy, Jamie. I like that. That's
Thank
spot
you.
on.
Tim, I thought we had an interesting conversation again as we bring it back to efficiencies and trying to reduce cost as much as possible. You mentioned to me that if you work with, let's say, a technology provider, if the OSC is working with a technology you're familiar with, like a Prevail or a GCC High, and maybe their MSP, someone you've dealt with, and or their consultants, you often see some efficiencies. Could you just talk a little bit more about how that helps ease the assessment burden?
Absolutely. So as we get into the assessments a lot with Prevail over and over and over. We've gotten a lot more efficient and a lot more timely at conducting those assessments, which helps us drive costs down. So whenever we encounter tools that we're familiar with, whether they be GCC High or Amazon Fed Cloud or Google or like tools like Prevail, and there's a variety of other tools in the ecosystem out there. Again, we become adept at understanding the assessment. We understand how the shared responsibility matrix and models work between the OSCs and the external organizations, especially if there's ESPs in play here that are doing the work for you within that. And so that does help us be a lot more efficient. It gives us a little bit more. Well, we also know exactly what to look for too. So that could be a bit of a double-edged sword in the fact that you could implement a tool like GCC High or even Prevail inefficiently or incorrectly and be non-compliant. Just because you have the tool doesn't mean you're compliant. You need to really understand and seek the expertise to configure those things completely and ensure that you have somebody check it over if you don't already have those expertise in-house at all. So if you don't have someone who's a certified professional or who's got years of experience in governance frameworks for the federal government, then I would definitely turn to outside sources to come in and at least take a look at things prior to getting in contact with a C3PO and getting under assessment, because that can save you a lot of heartache in the long run. They can identify inefficiencies, misconfigurations, or any other type of problems that you may have out there. And like Robert said earlier, don't let the people you hire speak for you, because that's one of the things that we need to understand, that you understand that this is not the first time you're looking at your policies and procedures when we come in and conduct the interview. So it's always awkward to ask a question within the context of the assessment, and then it takes 5 or 8 minutes for someone to go sort through hundreds of pieces of paper to figure out where the answer is at out there, which also doesn't give us a big warm and fuzzy. And so in true auditing fashion, as we sense weakness, we tend to drill down into it, like adaptive testing, right? If we are confident, like you have the answers ready and you're just going and going and going, we feel really confident. We're probably not going to probe as deeply into something if we feel that, nope, they seem to got this in order, they're good to go. We could spend our time elsewhere that's more productive in getting through the assessment. So
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point where we're not saying you can't pass an assessment if you have unique technology and you have third parties that maybe haven't worked together, because ultimately the C3PAO's job is to call balls and strikes, but they kind of call them as they see it. You're very much the referees. Unfortunately, anybody that's ever watched an NFL game or really any sporting event knows that there's some gray area and there's some interpretation. And the more we can reduce the variables and the unknowns, the higher chance you're going to have it at being successful, when it comes to your assessment. And I think that's, a great segue into our second poll question here, which is when selecting, providers and technology, what is most important? And that is, finding a proven solution. Who's done it successfully, who's proven this model out. And that comes back to building out the right team. Find a team that has done this, find a team that is proven and has worked together. Again, doesn't mean that your individual situation, no one's going to guarantee you a successful outcome. In fact, if they do, you should
not
probably
allowed
walk
to.
away. But it's going to reduce the overall burden, and it's ideally going to make things much, much smoother when you work with proven technologies, proven service providers, and C3PAOs that are all familiar. And what's really important when you're working with a football team is that they're all working from the same playbook. They all understand the plays. This comes to the importance of documentation, and that's going to include, of course, your SSP, which is critical to success. And it's really kind of the foundation and the blueprint, for your overall assessment success and your organization's overall security success. But there's also other parts to the playbook, right? There's shared responsibility matrix for any of the external service providers you work with. There's, of course, all the documents that support your SSP, asset inventory, scoping, network diagrams, and et cetera. And again, Tim and Robert, I'll ask you, but I'm sure you've seen both really good SSPs, really bad SSPs. and probably everything in between. But when you are working, with maybe a technology provider or even a consultant that typically delivers an SSP in a similar format, we'll call it the playbook. I'm assuming that leads to a higher chance of success. Um, Robert, Tim, any thoughts there? Pretty
Yeah,
straightforward.
yeah, I'll jump in first. A solid SSP, in Robert McVeigh's humble opinion, a solid SSP is one that reads like I hate to say it, like kind of a stereo manual or like your playbook analogy. When you join a football team, whether it's football American or football European, there's playbooks. And part of your first process is to review the playbook. The playbook should basically answer all of your questions at maybe not at the deep level, but at a general enough level that you generally understand what policy procedure is applicable to every control, and how it's implemented across the organization. The better the SSP is when we show up. And so when we open that SSP and we look at that first control and it says, okay, the first control is governed by this policy and this is the person responsible for it. And this is the frequency that we update it. And it's associated with this customer responsibility or shared responsibility matrix. If you have that in the SSP right up front, you've just made the auditor's job a whole lot more efficient, because now they're going to be able to look at it and say, okay, let's go to the acceptable use policy, paragraph 5, got it. Let's go to your CRM. Okay, you do this, your MSP does this, got it. That level of efficiency in the SSP is going to be huge. It's going to reduce the amount of time. It also is a great document in the event that somebody gets hit by a bus. So I mean, it happens. I mean, people leave organizations. Somebody gets hit by a bus, virtually or not, or literally. You got to pick up the operation and figure out what's going on. If that SSP has that level of detail that the average, employee of the organization with at least a little bit of IT and technical background can open up, look at it and go, okay, I know how we do multi-factor. I know how we do access control. If they can see that very quickly in the SSP and then just use the process and the policy and the procedure documents and the CRMs as backups, you're in a great place for an assessment. When we open an SSP and the SSP says, 3.1.1 Boleg Alpha, maintain list of authorized users, and the SSP says, we maintain a list of authorized users. That's usually an indication that the next several days are going to be very, very painful with that organization, because they don't understand the control, number one. Number two, they're telling you they don't even understand their own process.
Thanks, Robert. And Tim, maybe shift gears just a little bit. I think we all understand the criticality of a strong SSP, but I still think there's maybe a little bit of confusion around what a good shared responsibility matrix looks like from your external service provider. And I would suspect you probably still run into OSCs that maybe don't even get SRMs from all of their ESPs. So maybe take a little bit of time, talk about that, what you're looking for, what it needs to address, and the criticality of the SRMs from external service providers.
Absolutely. And so let's start with this. So under CFR 32, Part 170, that's the regulation that governs us, C3PAOs and people within the ecosystem, and who has to be inspected and what has to be inspected. In this case here, you have two types of ESPs. Your first type of ESP will be an ESP that does not handle any FCI CUI. They just kind of fall in as like your augmented IT staff, and they're maybe working from your systems and your things, and they don't really contain much themselves. The second type of ESP is going to be one that either stores, transports, or processes CUI. Maybe they're conducting backups and they are the place where the backups are going to reside, and your CUI is in that backup itself. In that case in either case, I should say, having a shared responsibility matrix is not just a necessity, but it is an ultimate requirement. As a matter of fact, it could be an automatic failure of your assessment if you don't have those lines already delineated and clearly defined when we roll in there with our assessors, right? Because we have to understand, so yeah, everybody's seen that Spider-Man meme, right? Where you got the multiple Spider-Man just pointing at each other out there. And it's very uncomfortable to say, when you say, hey, on this control, we see that you guys are responsible for this. And sometimes that's like the first time they're hearing that, or it's not clearly defined in the contract. Usually see a lot of this when we go through like mock assessments, or we're kind of coming in and helping people through a self-assessment process. where they don't clearly have those relationships with the ESP clearly defined. So we identify that as a POAM item and a weakness in stating that, all right, the SLA that you've been given, the service level agreement, is essentially your, in some cases, your shared responsibility matrix. It'd be really nice if the ESP and you took the time to create a spreadsheet and say, for these controls, here's what I do. For these controls, here's what they do. So we understand who is responsible. And that goes back to Robert's comment earlier. Adequacy and sufficiency are the two things that we have to understand your artifacts that you give us by. Is it an adequate artifact? Does it sufficiently answer my question? And can I gander the proof through, either am I hearing the proof or am I seeing the proof on the screen that these things are ultimately in place and what you're doing is proper. Also, make sure that your ESP either has, if they do have CUI, store, transport, or process, they either need to have a FedRAMP moderate, or they need to be CMMC certified, or they need to have had an attestation done by somebody under 800-171 that year. Because when we come in as a C3PAO, if your ESP hasn't already gotten some sort of an inspection, even if they do just SPDs, SPAs, that's the security protection devices or assets, right? So if they're running your SIM tool, they're running your antivirus, they're running your MDR, EDR platforms, even in those cases, they have to be checked out first. Then we can evaluate you, the OSC, against that shared responsibility matrix second. So really, if they haven't been evaluated by somebody else or haven't taken that initiative to get evaluated, then you're really paying for both evaluations, and that could be costly.
Hey, Jamie, I noticed we got a Q&A. Somebody asked the question is, do we need an SRM for an ESP that does not access or handle CUI or SPD? There's a nuance there, and we're seeing a lot of MSPs try and play this Don Quixote game where they're saying, we don't process, transmit, or store CUI, and we don't have access to CUI or SPD, therefore we are not in scope of the assessment. And that might be the case, but the simplest answer, the simplest question to ask is, does anybody at the MSP have administrative rights to the environment that contains CUI? If the answer is yes, they have admin rights to the environment that contains CUI, then guess what? The SRM and the requirement for them to meet the controls that are associated with what they deliver now are in play, whether it's SPD or SPA, because at that moment they have access to the CUI. And that's the nuance that you need to put on the table is if you have access to the CUI, whether you process, transmit, or store it, it doesn't matter. Once you have access as an MSP, you're in play. As an ESP, you're in play for the assessment at that point. And you can argue all day long. And I'll tell you though, if you find a C3PO it's worth their salt, if that's the game that's getting played or the argument's getting pushed, I will offer your C3PO will probably fire you as a client because that's too great of a risk for us to say, okay, we're going to ignore these people over here at your MSP that have access to the CUI, but you're claiming because they don't have SPD or an SPA and they don't actually process, transmit, or store the CUI on their system that they're out of scope. That's not right at all. They're in scope because they have the ability to access the CUI. Whether they do or don't is an entirely different discussion.
So is it then the ability to access the CUI that brings them into scope, or is it that admin capability, or is it something in between?
It's that admin capability. We've seen, like in some cases, we've got MSPs where the only thing they're doing is maintaining, the boundary devices. They're setting up devices for them, but once they attach to the enclave or to the enterprise, they don't have access anymore and they have no admin rights. At that point, you could make the argument that they're just like anybody else in the organization. They don't have, but if they have admin rights to the system, all these arguments that we're not having access, et cetera, that all goes away because at that moment they have full access. And because they're not your employee, that's an entirely different situation. Now, you did mention earlier, and we've seen this in some cases, where you have an MSP that is not truly an MSP per se because they're providing people on-prem, they're administrating your systems on your behalf in your environment. That's where I would make the distinction that those are more like SETA contractors, or pardon the expression, butts in seats. If they're an extension of the organization, then I would treat them as part of the organization. But if they work from their entity, they work on their company's computers and they access your systems or your enclave remotely with admin rights, then I think Tim would agree with me on this one. They're in scope.
Okay. Yeah, the reason I asked the follow-up question is Prevail, I think, is a little bit unique in that we allow third-party admins to administer the system but not have any access to the CUI because it is fully end-to-end encrypted. So I just wasn't sure. I think they would probably still be in scope because they're managing an SPA, SPD, but they're not actually storing, processing, transmitting CUI at that time, even if you have
literally
admin
just a
rights.
footnote in your SSP, Jamie. It's the fact that like these people are doing these tasks, and that's identified in access control. Who's doing what, who has privileged versus non-privileged access to the system, and is that just clearly delineated? And also, do they have they signed and read the agreements that you have in order to be able to adhere to your policies of your organization, right? I mean, that's clearly a very low bar as far as that's concerned, and it doesn't add a lot of extra effort to make sure that everybody's well written in. I'd rather see an OSC be a bit overzealous and overachieve than to underachieve and not be successful.